Welcome to Apply IT. You are watching third video on series on JavaScript promises. In our previous video, we learned that promise is an object that is returned by an async call before any result of async operation is available. Later, when response of async operation is available, the result will be placed in promise result variable and the state will be reflected in promise state. Now in today's video, we are going to learn how exactly we can create promise object. So let's get started. So there are three ways to create promise objects. One is implicit and other two ways are explicit. So first let's understand how to create promise object implicitly. To create promise object implicitly, we need to understand what is the result of any synchronous function. So first we are going to define one synchronous function hello, which is a normal function which returns some value. And then we are going to convert this synchronous function into asynchronous function, and then we will call it and we'll try to see that what result we are getting. So let's go to Chrome browser and we practically see how we can create promise object implicitly. So this is our Google Chrome browser. We open its console or terminal using right click and inspect. We go to console tab of developer tools, and here we write normal function say hello, and from this function we return simple value, say hello. So here we have defined a normal function or a synchronous function, and now we are going to call this function. So we can see that whatever value is returned by this hello function, that is hello string, same result we are getting. Now let's convert this hello function into async function. So now we are going to convert this function into asynchronous function by writing keyword async in front of function definition. So we have defined this function. Now let's call that function. You can see that by simply writing this async keyword in front of this function definition, and when we call it, now we get promise object. So the response of this function, which is hello, is placed into a promise object. So in this way, even though we have not created promise object, but when we mark any function as async function, then caller is going to get promise object, not result. Result will be placed in the promise object. So basically when we call a function which is a normal function, whatever value is returned by that function, we get same value as a response of that function call. And if we mark that function as async, and even though the function is returning a simple value or object, that value will be placed in the promise object, and promise object will be returned to the caller. Now we'll see an explicit way of creating promise object. Now when we create promise object explicitly, we can either return fulfilled promise object or rejected promise object. So let's see that. So we write same function hello, and now we can use function say Promise.resolve to return a promise object that is fulfilled, and Promise.reject to create a promise object where state is rejected. So generally resolve will be used to return successful response, and reject will be used to return error response. So you can see here that we haven't marked this function as async. So even though function is not marked at async, that function can return promise object. So again, let's go back to Google Chrome and try to understand it. So we make function hello, and from this function now we return Promise.resolve and hello as a response of that function, and now we call it. So you can see that we are getting promise object. So this is obvious because we are returning promise object from this function. Now let's see how to return a rejected promise. So instead of promise.resolve, we write here reject, and we write some meaningful message, say network error, and now we call this hello function. So now we can see that we are getting promise whose state is rejected, and whatever was the response of the API call, for example, that was network error. So we are getting that network error as a promise result. In the explicit way of creating promise object, we can use static methods resolve and reject of promise to create promise object explicitly. So when we use promise.resolve, the state will be marked as fulfilled, and when we use promise.reject, the state of the promise object will be marked as rejected. Now we'll see third way of creating promise object. The third way of creating promise object is using promise constructor. So we can create promise object using promise constructor. To promise constructor, we are going to provide one function called executor function as an argument. So basically we are going to write code where we are going to provide an executor function as an argument or as an input to this promise constructor. And this promise constructor is going to create first promise object with the state will be pending and result is undefined, and after that promise constructor is going to call this executor function. Promise constructor will pass this resolve and reject as argument to this executor. So let's see what is the form or structure of that executor function. So executor function will get one function as resolve function and another is a reject function. Now the important thing about this executor function is this executor function can perform any asynchronous operation. That is, after what time we will get result that is not known. So such kind of operation can be performed inside this executor function. So whenever we call this promise constructor, it will create this promise object. Then it will call this. Immediately after calling this executor function, the promise constructor is going to return this promise object. So you can see that the state would be pending and result is not defined, and later on the result will be placed in this once this executor function has performed asynchronous operation and result is available. So now what are uses of this resolve function and reject function, or say resolve and reject parameters that are provided to executor function as input? So executor function can use this resolve function to place success result into this promise object, and executor function can use this reject function to place failure response into this promise object. So now we see the code to create promise object explicitly using promise constructor. So we write a function, and from this function we return a promise object by using this promise constructor, and to this promise constructor we are passing a function which is an executor function which takes two parameters, resolve and reject. We can use resolve to return successful response, and we can use reject to return unsuccessful response. So you can see here, depending upon which function we use, resolve or reject, the state will be reflected. Here state is fulfilled if you use resolve function, and here state is rejected if you use this reject function. So let's practically see this on Google Chrome. So let's write this hello function which creates promise object explicitly using promise constructor. So we write a function hello which returns a new promise object like this. Now this promise constructor takes one function called executor as input. So let's write that. This executor function as an input will get resolved and reject as input, and we can use this resolve and reject function to return appropriate response. So first let's use resolve, and we write return value as hello. So we are defining this function. Now let's call it. So we call this hello function, you can see that we are getting response as promise object where state is fulfilled and response is this hello. So we can treat this hello as response of an API call. Now let's use reject instead of resolve. So here we use reject, and here we write some error message, say network error. So we have defined this hello function which is returning rejected promise. Now let's call it. We call this hello function, so you can see that it is returning a promise object where state is rejected and result is this network error. So in this way we can create promise object explicitly using promise constructor, and we provide executor function as input to this promise constructor. In this example, we have seen that we are not performing any asynchronous operation, but later on we are going to modify this and we are going to perform some async operation in this executor function. So we have understood this, that we can create promise object explicitly by using promise constructor, and we supply this executor function as input, and that executor function will get resolve and reject as a parameter, and we can use them to return this promise object as a fulfill or rejected. So we can understand that we have this code where we have this promise constructor. Inside this promise constructor, we are passing this executor function, and executor function is using this resolve parameter or resolve function to return promise object that is fulfilled. So in this way we can create promise object. So when we create promise object, we need to pass this executor function to this promise constructor, and promise constructor internally is going to create promise object, and immediately after that it is going to call this executor function, and that executor function gets two functions. One is resolve to resolve a promise, that is for successful operation, and another is reject to reject a promise to generate any error. That error will generally indicate unsuccessful or say error condition of async operation. Same way is for when we use reject. If we use reject, then promise state will be reflected as rejected, and the result will be whatever we supply as a argument to this reject function. So in summary, we try to understand all possible combinations of functions. So function could be synchronous function or it could be asynchronous function, and function can return simple value or object, or it can return promise object itself. So if function is synchronous function and function is returning value or object, the caller will get that particular value or object. If function is synchronous function and that function returns promise object, then obvious caller will get that promise object. That promise object will be wrapping the response of async operation that is done by executor function of the promise constructor. And if function is async function that is returning a promise object explicitly, so that promise object will wrap response of that async operation that is done by the executor function that is provided to the promise constructor. Now the interesting case is this one where our function is asynchronous function, but that is not returning a promise object. It is returning a simple value or simple object. But when caller calls this async function, the caller is not going to get that value. Caller is going to get promise object that will be wrapping the value that is returned by that async function. That is what we have seen in the first case where we converted our normal function into async function here in this example. So let's try to understand difference between a return value is a promise versus result. So whenever function is not async, so we are trying to understand this case that function is a synchronous function. So when function is not async function, then caller of that function will get blocked. You can see that here that caller is making a call to synchronous function. Caller will get blocked and caller will get that result at some later point. That is shown here, that this is the indication of that it is a blocking call. So synchronous function is going to return result. So return value of this sync function will be result itself. But if function is an async function, then caller can decide that whether it wants to wait for the result or it wants to continue its some other work. So that is shown here that async function is not going to return the result, it is going to return a promise object, and the result itself will be placed in this. And whenever that result become available, that result will be placed in this promise result data member of the promise object using resolve and reject functions that were provided as an input to the executor function. So async function does not return result, rather it returns a promise, and that promise will be returned immediately. So in this video we have understood 3 ways of creating promise object. One is implicit and other 2 ways are explicit. In the next video we'll understand how to receive the response that is generated by this async operation. So we'll see use of then and catch in our next video. Let me know how this video was useful to you in understanding the concept of promise. Write in the comment section how this particular video was useful to you. Thanks for watching and happy learning. We'll see you in the next video.